My husband on the autism spectrum, he has high functioning autism, is very stubborn and is often angry. He also has severe anxiety. Is it possible that the anxiety is causing him to act out in various ways? Well, the short answer to that would be yes, pretty much 100% of the time. A common theme does exist among people with Asperger's and high-functioning autism, specifically their tendency to exhibit both behavioral and cognitive rigidity, which spouses often perceive as stubbornness and being insensitive, selfish, uncaring, narcissistic, and numerous other adjectives. But the behavioral and cognitive rigidity that gets perceived as just rude behavior is definitely a response to anxiety. There's a strong correlation between anxiety and inflexibility, and that can be evident at home, and it also can be evident in the workplace. So a vulnerability to anxiety is definitely an intrinsic feature of Asperger's or high-functioning autism, and that's due to three different things, really. It's due to a specific neurotransmitter system defect. It's also due to a breakdown in circuitry related to extinguishing fear responses. And it's also a secondary consequence of the individual's inability to make appropriate social judgments. So there's numerous factors at play that increase anxiety in people on the autism spectrum. I could spend the next hour talking about that, but I'll try to keep this answer fairly short. A lack of empathy significantly limits skills for autonomous social problem solving. For example, the individual is unaware in many cases that he has said hurtful things or behaved in inappropriate ways. And this results in him, we'll use the example of an NT wife and the husband with autism. This behavior that he exhibits often gets him in trouble with his wife. I work with men on the autism spectrum a lot, and it seems like they all say, yeah, they're in the doghouse, and they feel like they're always in trouble. So this all relates to a lack of empathy, or we will call it a lack of displayed empathy. They have empathy, they just don't necessarily display it. And this limits skills for autonomous social problem solving. Social problem solving, that's an important term to remember. Limitations in generalizing from one situation to another often contribute to in this case, the autistic husband repeating the same social mistakes over and over again. If he gets into a heated argument with his NT wife over a specific problem, and she conveys to him what he needs to do differently next time, he will get it with that specific problem. But if there's a second problem that's just slightly different, he may not necessarily be able to generalize from the first problem to the second problem. Also, another factor that is at play that increases anxiety is the individual's inability to grasp social cues, facial expressions, body language, and so on. So this creates a lot of repeated social errors because he's misinterpreting what is being expressed to him. Social limitations also make it difficult for him to develop coping strategies to soothe himself and to contain difficult emotions. And so those are just a few. There's many more. The circumstances that raise the anxiety level for people on the autism spectrum often result in their increased need to control people, places, and things. This need for control takes the form of rigidity, which is what you were referring to in your question as stubbornness. So there's behavioral rigidity and cognitive rigidity. Behavior rigidity refers to the person's difficulty in maintaining appropriate behavior in new and unfamiliar situations. Okay? And then there's cognitive rigidity, and this occurs when the individual is unable to consider alternatives to the current situation, alternative viewpoints, or innovative solutions to a problem. People with rigid thinking do tend to view situations in either or terms. It's either right or wrong, good, bad, black, white. They want concrete black and white answers, and the gray areas of life are often very uncomfortable for people with behavioral and cognitive rigidity. Symptoms of rigidity often introduce some of the most disruptive chronic behaviors exhibited by people on the autism spectrum. For example, aggression, difficulties tolerating changes in routine, dislike of changes to plans that have been previously laid out. You may have experienced with your partner on the spectrum his or her meltdowns, frustration, shutdowns, and problems with minor differences in the environment. I get a lot of feedback from NT wives that say they feel that they're always walking on eggshells in an effort to circumvent any extreme reaction from their very brittle Asperger's husband. In addition, the husband himself may articulate his anxiety over fears that things will not go according to plan, or that he'll be forced to make changes that he can't handle. Sometimes these behaviors are identified as obsessive compulsive because of the husband's need for ritualized order or non-functional routine. In other words, he has a strong need for sameness. So, as one can easily imagine, behavioral and cognitive rigidity causes many problems in relationships, which usually result in a higher level of anxiety for the person on the autism spectrum. Therefore, this cycle just continues at that point. Hey guys, this is Mark Hutten with AdultAspergersChat.com, and I wanted to talk to the men out there on the autism spectrum who have anxiety. And if you're like most, as in like 100% of other people on the autism spectrum, anxiety just comes with the territory, right? But I don't want you to view anxiety as altogether a bad thing. Actually, there's a part of anxiety that is a good thing, even a survival mechanism. Now, we certainly don't want to have anxiety over everything all the time, but we are designed to have some anxiety over some things some of the time. So anxiety is actually a call to action. If you have some unresolved anxiety in your relationship, your anxiety is telling you that there is something not working quite right and change needs to happen. So it's good that you have some anxiety. If you don't have anxiety, you're either dead or you're a psychopath. And if you're listening to this video, you're not dead. And if you're not in prison, chances are pretty good you're not a psychopath. The message today is for you to view some of your anxiety as a call to action. It's a message that your brain is trying to send to you saying something is not functioning the way it can be and we need to change it. On that note, I have a men's group coming up for people on the autism spectrum who are having trouble in their relationships, and you don't have to have a formal diagnosis to join this group. So check it out, click on the link below. As you may know, if you have Asperger's syndrome, or if you live with somebody who has Asperger's syndrome, anxiety is a huge issue. I would say pretty much everybody who has Asperger's or high-functioning autism also by default has anxiety issues. And I want to talk briefly about that. You know, when you're afraid of, you can think of fear as you're afraid of something and you know exactly what it is. You know, you have to go to the dentist next week and have a root canal, or have some other medical procedure done, or you have a job interview, or you're going to have to go have dinner with the in-laws. You know, there's some future event, and you know that you know exactly what it is, and it does create a bit of angst inside of you. Then there's anxiety, which is you're afraid of something, but you don't know what it is. It's kind of mysterious. So if you are having anxiety, you're worried about something in the future that hasn't happened yet, and quite honestly, may never happen. How many times have you worried about something and the thing never happened? If you're honest with yourself, that's about 99% of the time. So, in this sense, anxiety is fiction. You're spending a lot of time and mental energy, which is exhausting, by the way, on something that doesn't exist. Think about this. Anxiety is nothing more than your thoughts. It's not something outside of you. If you're anxious about something, it's not some external thing that you need to be concerned about, some boogeyman that's going to get you. It's something inside of your damn head. It's inside of you. It's not something looming outside of you that you don't have any control over. It's inside of your brain, and you do have control over that. You have to learn that skill. It's not something you can just will yourself to do. You're going to have to practice. You're going to have to train how to do various anxiety reduction techniques. And there are plenty of those. So, on that note, I have a few links underneath this video if you want to explore this further. Thanks, guys. This is Mark Hutten with AdultAspergersChat.com.
Mark, I have a question, and I'm okay with you adding my voice message and your answer to a public YouTube video. My question is, what's the best way for people with Asperger's to manage their anxiety? Thank you, Ken.
Well, in answer to the question, there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all or a cookie-cutter approach for anxiety, because what causes your anxiety might not cause anxiety for somebody else, and what alleviates your anxiety might not alleviate that anxiety in somebody else. So it's going to be a very individual approach to find out what works best for you. But let's make a distinction between fear and anxiety, because fear is something that you're afraid of, but you know exactly what it is. For example, let's say you hate going to the dentist and you've got to go to the dentist next week, and you know you're going to sit there and get a cavity worked on, and you kind of predict what's going to go on. You already know, because you've been there and done it before. So yes, there's some apprehension there, but you know what's going to happen. Anxiety, though, is being afraid of something and you don't know what it is. You just know that you feel anxious, and the anxiety that's going on in the moment is not the event itself, because you don't even know what the event is. It's your self-talk. So we have to look at self-talk. So if the event actually manifests itself in your life, the one that you've been worrying about so much, that actual event will be way less emotionally painful than the worrying about that event prior to the actual occurrence. The actual event is not the source of your anxiety. It's the thinking about the event that is the source of your anxiety. Think of it like this. Let's say you're in college, you've got a big exam coming up, maybe it's the final, and it's super important that you get a good grade on this. And maybe you have some test anxiety, and so you engage in this if-then business. If I freeze up, then I might flunk this test. Or if it's harder than I think, and if I didn't study enough for this test, I may get a bad grade. And if I don't pass this exam, I may flunk the course. And if I flunk the course, I may have to take it again. And if I have to take the course again, then it's going to take longer for me to get my degree. And if it takes longer for me to get my degree, it's going to cost me more money. And if my parents are helping me financially, they may get upset with me for taking longer than expected. And so you get in this if-then loop, a bunch of what ifs, and that is the anxiety. Another example is there was a lady who had IBS symptoms and it triggered her anxiety, and so her commute was particularly stressful. So she gets up and she starts having some stomach issues, and then she starts getting sucked into this if-then loop. If I have stomach troubles this morning, then I'm going to have anxiety on the way to work. And if I have anxiety on the way to work, then I'm going to have to stop at a gas station somewhere on an emergency basis. And if I do that, then I'm going to be late for work. And if I'm late for work, then I'm going to get a point. And if I get too many points, I'm going to get fired. And so you're down in this rabbit hole of what ifs. There again, that is the anxiety, not so much the drive to work in and of itself. So you get the point, right? The anxiety is the what if business. It is the if-then loop that you get sucked into. So what we can do in that case is we can look for triggers to our anxiety and maybe even journal those. It wouldn't necessarily have to be a notebook. It could be one piece of paper. And so after you have an anxiety-provoking event and you're calm, you could write down, okay, what happened right before I got anxious? That is the trigger. And then you would also want to write down what was my self-talk during this anxiety-provoking event. So let's use an example of an husband on the autism spectrum, and his neurotypical wife is upset about something, and so she is asking a lot of questions. You know, maybe she's saying things like, why can't you ever blah, 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 or why do you always do such and such, or what were you thinking when you didn't follow through with blah, blah, blah. And so she's upset and she's kind of interrogating, and so that is the anxiety-provoking event. And then maybe your self-talk was, oh my God, here we go again, complain, complain, complain. I'm always in trouble. I didn't do anything wrong. Why is she treating me like a child? I feel so criticized. I have to defend myself. I have to prove that she is wrong, etc. So in this example, her complaints about the relationship not going right did download as a trigger for you, but it was the self-talk that exacerbated the anxiety. So what do we want to do? We want to begin the business of practicing different self-talk. So using the example that I just illustrated where she is upset and she's kind of quizzing you, why can't you do this? Why do you always do that? Because she's frustrated and at her wit's end, and you're downloading that as nothing but criticism and put downs and shaming and blaming. So what could you do differently next time in the way of self-talk? Here's some ideas. I could realize that she's quizzing me because the relationship is really important to her. Another thought could be, I'll stay and listen, and then I'll paraphrase back what I heard so I can understand her point. In other words, I'm going to listen to understand rather than listen to mount a defense. Another thought could be, I'll ask what I can do to help rather than just do some version of shutdown or meltdown. So we want to replace the negative self-talk that sets us up for the if-then loop with more positive, constructive, and realistic inner dialogue that is more representative of what might actually be going on. So in summary, the best anxiety reduction strategy for you will be for you to identify what types of self-talk you engage in when you're in the throes of a particular anxiety-producing event. And each event will trigger different self-talk. You want to look at those, and you want to begin the process of coming up with some deliberate replacements for the negative self-talk. So that's the key term, deliberate. You will have to start thinking deliberately when you're in the middle of the storm. A meltdown can be viewed as consisting of three phases. There's the escalation of anxiety, the explosion of pent-up anxiety, and post-explosion. Together, they make up the meltdown cycle. In this process, the escalation phase is characterized by cues that indicate anxiety is building. Now, these cues can be physical, behavioral, emotional, or cognitive, and they are warning signs or responses to anxiety-provoking events. Events, on the other hand, are situations that occur every day that may lead to escalations of anxiety if effective anxiety control methods are not used. Red flag events are types of situations that are unique to you and that you are especially sensitive to because of past events. And these events can involve internal processes, for example, thinking about situations that were anxiety-provoking in the past, or external processes. For example, experiencing real-life anxiety-provoking situations in the here and now. If the escalation phase is allowed to continue, the explosion phase will follow. Now, the explosion phase is marked by an uncontrollable discharge of anxiety displayed as verbal or physical aggression. Now, this discharge in turn leads to negative consequences, and it's synonymous with the number 10 on an emotional dysregulation meter. You could think of this meter as similar to a thermometer. The final stage of the meltdown cycle is the post-explosion phase, and it's characterized by negative consequences that resulted from the verbal or physical aggression that was displayed during the explosion phase. These consequences could include feelings of guilt, shame, regret, a post-meltdown shutdown. In other words, he explodes and then later on he goes and hibernates and isolates and tries to stay away from people. Separation or divorce, family members and friends that no longer want to be around you, being terminated from a job, and in some cases even going to jail. Now, the intensity, frequency, and duration of anxiety in a meltdown cycle varies among individuals. For example, one person's anxiety may escalate rapidly after a provocative event and within just a few minutes reach the explosion phase. Another's anxiety may escalate slowly but steadily over several hours before reaching the explosion phase. So it will be important to understand your pattern here. In other words, do you go from 1 to 100 miles an hour quickly, or do you creep up from 1 mile an hour to 100 miles an hour over the course of several minutes or even up to an hour? Also, one may experience more episodes of anxiety and progress through the meltdown cycle more often than the other. However, both people, despite differences in how quickly their anxiety escalates and how frequently they experience anxiety, will undergo all three phases of the meltdown cycle. The intensity of anxiety from one person to the next also will be different. One person may engage in more violent behavior than the other in the explosion phase. For example, he might assault someone. The other person may express his anxiety during the explosion phase by shouting at or threatening another person. But regardless of these individual differences, the explosion phase is synonymous with losing control and becoming verbally or physically aggressive, and we call this emotional dysregulation. Another term that is used but doesn't quite capture the severity of this situation is low frustration tolerance. Now, notice that the escalation and explosion phases of the meltdown cycle correspond to the levels on the emotional dysregulation meter. The points below 10 on the meter represent the escalation phase, or the building up of anxiety. The explosion phase, on the other hand, corresponds to 10 on this meter, and it is kind of an imaginary meter at this point. So again, 10 on the meter is the point at which one loses control and expresses anxiety through verbal or physical aggression that leads to negative consequences. One of the primary objectives of anxiety control treatment is to keep from reaching the explosion phase. And this is accomplished by using the emotional dysregulation meter to monitor changes in your anxiety, attending to the cues or warning signs that indicate anxiety is building, and employing the appropriate methods from your anxiety control plan to stop escalation. If the explosion phase is prevented from occurring, the post-explosion phase will not occur and the meltdown cycle will be broken. So if you use your anxiety control plan effectively, your anxiety should ideally reach between a 1 and a 9 on the emotional dysregulation meter. By preventing the explosion phase, which is a 10, you will not experience the same level of negative consequences of the post-explosion phase, and you will then be able to break the destructive cycle. Hey guys, this is Mark Hutten with AdultAspergersChat.com, and I often get a lot of neurotypical spouses wanting to inquire about why their partner with Asperger's syndrome or high-functioning autism has meltdowns. And I got an email recently, and I get a lot of these, and in essence, this is a neurotypical wife, and she's wanting to understand more fully why her Asperger's husband has meltdowns. before we can address that, we'll have to look at anxiety, because a meltdown or a shutdown is a result of high anxiety. And so you could think of a meltdown as simply a symptom of anxiety. If your husband, for example, who has Asperger's syndrome, goes into a meltdown or a shutdown, you can bet that what preceded that was something that raised his anxiety. We'll just call this the anxiety cycle, and a meltdown will be part of this cycle. So unfortunately, it's very common for people with Asperger's to experience more than their fair share of stress. And honestly, to make matters worse, many of these people lack the ability to manage their stress effectively. They've come up with some coping mechanisms to deal with it, and unfortunately, many of these mechanisms are dysfunctional. In other words, they kind of make a bad problem worse, or they solve the problem temporarily only. So individuals with Asperger's are particularly prone to anxiety disorders as a consequence of the social demands made on them. Any social contact can generate anxiety as to how to start, maintain, and end the activity or conversation. Changes to daily routine can exacerbate the anxiety, and also certain sensory sensitivities can also contribute to that. Many of my clients have reported feeling anxious for no apparent reason at all. They were fine the previous day, they wake up, they get started with their day, and for some reason they're anxious, and they can't pinpoint it. They can't attribute it to any particular event or something that somebody said or did. So not only do people with Asperger's and high functioning autism experience anxiety, oftentimes it's random and for no apparent reason. Perhaps some of these individuals take life too seriously. Perhaps they take others' behavior and comments too personally, and perhaps they just generally view themselves as worrywarts, and so they've kind of labeled themselves that way. And so chronically worrying that something bad will happen or something good won't happen has honestly just become a habit. And that's an important concept. Once you have anxiety for a period of time, it actually becomes a habit, and it operates at an unconscious level. So that's the first thing that happens in this business that relates to a meltdown, is the anxiety piece. What follows then is the need for anxiety reduction, of course. Nobody can go through day after day, 365 days a week under high anxiety without having some kind of problem or searching for some kind of remedy. And as I mentioned a little bit ago, unfortunately, in many cases, their anxiety reduction techniques actually create more problems or further their anxiety or drive people away, or can result in school suspension, job loss, divorce, and so on. So they do try to manage their anxiety in healthful ways. They think for example, distracting themselves by engaging in their special interest for excessive amounts of time. Some people turn to marijuana, some people turn to alcohol, various things, and some work to some degree, some don't work at all, and some only work temporarily. But the two main things that they do for anxiety reduction would be, of course, the shutdown, and that is where they just hibernate. They just want to be by themselves, and they withdraw, don't want to talk to anybody. They just want to temporarily take a time out and escape from the world. And then the other thing they do, the opposite end of the spectrum of a shutdown, would be the meltdown, and that's what we're trying to address today. So as this anxiety, whatever its cause, builds up and builds up, eventually the dam breaks, so to speak, usually over something very small. It's literally the straw that breaks the camel's back. Under severe enough stress, any normally calm and collected person with Asperger's may become totally out of control and have a huge explosion. And that's usually what people see when they see somebody having a meltdown. So those who experience meltdowns are often perceived by others as always being angry. I hear from neurotypical spouses all the time that their Asperger's husband only shows anger. When he's sad, it shows up as anger. If he's mad, it shows up as anger. If he's depressed, all he displays is anger. Even though they do have several emotions underneath there, they only show the surface emotion, which is anger. Rage may be a common reaction experienced when coming to terms with problems in employment, relationships, friendships, and other areas in life affected by Asperger's. There is often this on-off quality to the person's rage, where the person may be calm minutes later after a meltdown, while the people around are stunned and shocked that what they just witnessed. And so, in this case, the Asperger's man is, after he's had his meltdown, 5 minutes later he's fine, and everybody else is still going, what the hell happened, and they're still in a state of shock. Neurotypical spouses often struggle to understand these meltdowns, with resentment and bitterness often building up over time. In some cases, the Asperger's individual may not even acknowledge he has trouble with rage, and he will blame others for provoking him. And as you can well imagine, this creates a lot of conflict in the marriage. There would literally be hundreds of examples of how meltdowns can play out, but for the sake of this video here, we're going to just discuss the following example, and we'll apply this example throughout. So, let's say the Asperger's individual's had a rough day at work, but he was able to kind of maintain his composure for the most part through the day. But when he gets home, his wife makes a comment that she didn't think was particularly provoking or upsetting, but that hits the man wrong for some reason, and he explodes. So in other words, he kind of takes out his anxiety that he experienced through the day. He takes that out on his wife, unintentionally, of course. I mean, it wasn't premeditated. He didn't think on the way home, I'm going to give my wife hell when I walk in the door. But he was already in a position where he was about to explode, and it didn't take much more steam to blow the lid off of that kettle. So the next phase in this anxiety cycle is guilt. And we're going to use the example of the guy coming home from work, okay? So if this particular scenario plays itself out numerous times over months and years, in other words, it seems to be a theme or a pattern that he always comes home in a bad mood and to one degree or another takes it out on his wife, the Asperger's husband in this case will come to believe that he's the victim of his emotions. In this case, work-related stress expressed in the form of misplaced anger toward his wife. But not only does he feel like a victim of circumstances, he also feels an element of guilt and remorse for hurting the people that he loves. He may have tried numerous times to avoid repeating this scenario, where he comes home and he knows he's taking out his anger on his wife when really it should have been directed at the coworker that pissed him off earlier in the day. But even though he tries to avoid the meltdown, he still has this work-related stress that's unresolved, and he hasn't figured out a way to deal with this stress in a functional, non-destructive way. So since he keeps repeating this same cycle that he doesn't want to repeat, he's beginning to feel very guilty about the whole damn thing. So what do you do when you have ongoing toxic guilt? Well, what happens next in this cycle is self-punishment. As a result of repeated social failures, in other words, in this case, numerous negative encounters with his wife, the person with Asperger's may come to the conclusion that he doesn't deserve love, he doesn't deserve compassion, he doesn't deserve to have a peaceful lifestyle. Therefore, he may do destructive things to punish himself. For example, beating up on himself with negative self-talk, drinking or drug use, overeating, isolation, and possibly even separation or divorce. In other words, he's the one that initiates separation or divorce because he thinks that he deserves that. Guilt is supposed to be a pro-social emotion. In other words, it functions to preserve important relationships. But many people with Asperger's who experience repeated exposures to this anxiety cycle that we're talking about here have unresolved guilt, which literally prevents them from enjoying life and thriving emotionally. Instead, they're just trying to survive life, and they're just trying to survive emotionally. So the whole thing started off with anxiety. He tried to reduce his anxiety, in this case with numerous dysfunctional methods that didn't work. And so since he couldn't come up with an anxiety reduction method that worked, he went to the default meltdown. In other words, the anxiety built up so much that he couldn't even engage in any kind of hopeful interventions at that point. It was just explosion time. Then he feels guilty for these explosions. Then he punishes himself for these explosions, and we've gone full circle right back to anxiety again, because all of these different steps in the cycle are hugely stressful. So months or even years of experiencing numerous negative emotions, stress, frustration, anger, rage, guilt, and so on, obviously can make relationships so problematic that the better option becomes living alone or avoiding human contact as much as possible. In many cases, the man gets divorced and he just decides, I'm never getting married again. I'm never going to try this love thing again. I suck at it and I hurt people and I'm just better off left to my own company. But unfortunately, all of us are social creatures by nature. As human beings, we need other people. Therefore, living a life of solitude carries its own element of anxiety because people need other people. And so when he chooses a solitary lifestyle, he's by default chosen to make his anxiety even worse. She wants emotional reciprocity, she being the NT wife, neurotypical. But in pretty much all cases, and I work with men only, women only, groups of couples only. I have all the demographics covered, all the bases covered. And in almost all cases, the NT wife's approach to try to get you to be emotionally reciprocal ends up raising your anxiety such that you want to just disconnect from her, purely for anxiety reduction purposes, which yields the opposite result of what she's trying to do. And I'm not trying to blame her I'm not trying to blame anybody, but I will go on record as saying that her method of getting you to be a team player and getting you to connect and be more empathic and affectionate, her method of going about that has in too many cases driven you away, which makes, not to blame her, I mean, you have your share, you're contributing to the issues as well, but when you pull away, and in many cases, I got to tell you guys, in many cases, she has become his number one source of anxiety. She's come that far up in status as she is now my number one source of anxiety. I mean, I'm not saying that connecting with her is not important to you. It's not what I'm saying. I'm saying her need for the connection is more important to her than it is you. And if she were here, she would say, you don't provide enough emotional reciprocity, that you don't listen. I'm just going to make some things up that you've probably heard. You don't listen, you don't empathize, you don't validate me, and so on and so on. You've probably heard it all many times before. And so if this has gone on for years and years and years, you may have experienced this too. She is super resentful and angry, and maybe even at some level revengeful. And so what has happened, and I'm not blaming you guys, you're wired the way that you're wired. There's nothing wrong with you. It is what it is. But by virtue of your supposed lack of empathy and her heightened resentment, we're going to call that a cancer in the relationship. So you guys, most of you are experiencing a relationship cancer right now, and you're in the middle. You've just begun treatment last week. Last Wednesday, you just began treatment. And so the whole point of this conversation is that you can, as much as I almost hate to say it, because it sounds kind of disconcerting at some level, you guys are in for the long haul. You have to be in for the long haul. This is not something we're going to resolve in a few weeks of meeting here. You're going to have to apply the assignments that we talk about. You're going to have to be consistent with it. And she is going to have to see some significant change. So there's actually going to be three things. It's going to have to be significant change. In other words, something that really stands out in her attention. It's going to have to be consistent change. In other words, change that remains consistent over time. And with those two things, a fairly radical change that she views, consistent over time, then and only then will she begin to reduce her resentment level. Right now, it's most likely that many of you guys are experiencing the thing where her heart is cold as ice. And she probably has lost trust. She's probably given up hope in some cases. And she's also probably reluctant to give you the benefit of the doubt so early, even if she does witness some significant change, because if she were here, she would say, well, I know there's been times before when he's changed, supposedly changed, but it never lasted very long. And, it was just a matter of time before he went back to his old ways. So even if she saw some consistent change, in you, a significant change in your empathy level, we'll say, she still wouldn't be necessarily willing to acknowledge it, because she would be concerned that if I start having hope again and he lets me down again, I'm not sure I can handle it. So she may even be withholding affection or acknowledgement or praise or pointing out that you're actually doing something right for fear of being let down again. So everybody in here is in for a long haul deal. You have to be willing to tough this out and realize that this fix, for the lack of a better term, is not going to happen anytime soon. That's not to say you wouldn't see some improvement if you're doing the assignments. You should be able to see some improvement in her response to you, but it's not going to be anything real super observable or noticeable for quite a while, because again, she's going to have to see significant change, and she's going to have to see that spread out over the course of the next several months before she's going to have a change in attitude. And that change of attitude in her mind would be, you know what, he is making some significant changes, and he has been consistently doing so over the last 3 or 4 months. Maybe he really has turned the corner. So the general philosophy of people on the autism spectrum, and this is very generalized, by the way, is based in the belief system that people are largely just in the way of me completing tasks. People are mostly an impediment to me engaging in my special interest. People are mostly obstacles to me engaging in my self-soothing anxiety reduction activities. So based on that belief system, the inner dialogue or self-talk is usually along the lines of, I must be able to engage in my special interest as often as possible for anxiety reduction reasons. I need to be distracted with something pleasurable to escape the anxieties experienced in the real world. And I need to engage in activities that alleviate boredom, because most things outside of my special interest are painfully boring. So based on that self-talk, the emotion that's evoked is often one of frustration. In fact, it is exceedingly common, in fact, we will say 100% of the time, for people on the autism spectrum to have low frustration tolerance. Feelings of frustration are largely due to people getting in the way of completing tasks, disrupting their routine and structure, and imposing change on them, unwanted change. When this happens, the feelings of frustration can then graduate to anger or anxiety overload, the first of which may manifest in the form of a meltdown or tantrum, the second of which may result in a shutdown. So based on that particular belief system and the associated self-talk and the associated feelings of frustration and anger, behaviorally, the individual will appear rigid, self-absorbed, disconnected from relationships, and preoccupied with things. In other words, tasks, objects, facts, figures, and so on. Hey guys, this is Mark Hutten with AdultAspergersChat.com, and today I have a message for the NT spouses. And of course, we know that NTs can be male or female. We know ASD individuals can be male or female. I'm going to use the example where she is the NT and he is the guy on the autism spectrum. And so she will often say, we still have problems. He's not improving. Nothing gets better. We're still having communication breakdown and so on. And then on closer inspection, I realize that she is continuing to treat him like a neurotypical. She continues to insist on approaching him as if he was normal. He is not normal. Stop it, okay? He's not normal. And the more you assume that he is going to respond to your neurotypical ways, the more frustrated you're going to be. You wouldn't treat a snapping turtle like a toy poodle, right? You wouldn't give a snapping turtle a bone. You wouldn't play catch with it. You wouldn't have it sit on your lap and pet it. You wouldn't take it to the groomers. You wouldn't take it for a walk around the park and so on. And the longer you treated the snapping turtle like a toy poodle, the more frustrated this turtle is going to get, to the point where he may snap, and now you're missing the tip of your thumb and you wonder what you did wrong. Here's a rhetorical question for you. Let's pretend that you met up with somebody from a different planet. And this person had a blind spot, a huge blind spot, with respect to how you think, how you feel and why you behave the way you do. How would you try to communicate with that entity? How would you respond? How would you try to help? So in this example, let's say that you realize that this person from a different planet had this huge blind spot, but then you took it on yourself to try to improve him, as if he shouldn't be wired that way. And in this scenario, imagine that the harder you tried to fix a deficit that you perceived to be a deficit, the bigger his blind spots became. And then it got to the point where this entity gets so frustrated that now he gives up trying to communicate with you at all. Because, ladies, that's what you're dealing with. You're dealing with somebody who has a huge blind spot with respect to what and why you think the way you do, what and why you feel the way you do, what and why you behave the way you do. And so when you take offense of that, and I'm not blaming you, it's easy to do, but when you take offense of that and try to get him to get it, you're treating your snapping turtle like a toy poodle. And it's getting tired of being dragged around by a dog leash. And the more you do this, the more that snapping turtle is going to get frustrated and snap back. Fighting multiple battles is making you physically and mentally sick. I run into all the time, really, neurodiverse couples who fight every battle that comes down the pike. Neurodiverse couples are notorious for just piling a bunch of disputes on the table without categorizing, prioritizing. They won't talk about how sex isn't good, the money problems, kid problems, quality time or lack thereof, chores are not getting done, or somebody feels like they're doing all the chores, and pet peeves, dirty dishes, the in-laws, and the list just goes on. And they're both just chasing their tails, quite honestly. And the problem with that is, if you are not judicious about which battles to fight and you just fight everything, then you become toxic to one another. And you get the two of you in the same room, and it almost always ends up in some kind of a debate or argument or fight, etc. The problem with this is people who fight every battle that comes down the pike also are in a lot of emotional pain. Chronic, low-grade emotional pain is what I call it. And those who are in a chronic, low-grade emotional pain tend to perceive slights and disrespect where there is none. And if they are always on the alert for any sign of disrespect or lack of cooperation or a personal insult or being controlled by the other person, etc., they're going to be much more willing to continue to fight every battle that comes down the pike. So over time, they're fighting more and more battles, thus increasing the emotional pain, and you're in this cycle. So obviously, you would want to do the opposite of that. And my suggestion would be to pick the top 3 issues that you want to resolve. I'm not saying don't fight any battles, and I am saying you want to do fair fighting, but you don't want to fight every battle that comes down the pike. And so I would say pick 3. Just for starters, pick 3, but don't fight all 3 at one time. So brainstorm about the most important issues. Keep it to 3 just for now. Try to have some dialogue on one of those 3. And then when you get some resolve on one of those, then you can move on to the second one. Then you can move on to the third one. All others are not fair game for one damn comment. Let me repeat that. Anything outside of those top 3 is not fair game for debate, argument, discussion, etc. Pick your battles carefully. And if you choose to fight every battle that comes down the pike, you are choosing mental illness and physical illness. And if you're getting sick by fighting too many battles at once, hasn't manifested in mental health issues or physical health issues yet, give it a few years, and then you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So another common concern that comes up with NT wives about their autistic husband is she will say something along the lines of, he won't answer my questions. I'll ask him, what took you so long? He will say, I don't know. Or she'll ask, what are you planning to do with such and such? And he'll say, never mind. Or he just won't respond to her questions at all. And so what's up with this in the vast majority of cases is he knows that if he answers that question, that's just going to open the floodgates for a bunch of other questions. Or he's simply afraid to answer the question because he feels like he's going to get in trouble for the answer. So if you have asked him a question and then he answers your question, but then you follow that up with 12 other questions, he's going to download that as I'm being interrogated, this raises my anxiety. Or if you have asked a question and he gave you the answer and you didn't like it and then you had a problem with the answer and chastised him accordingly, then he's going to be gun shy about answering any of your questions. Or he is going to give you the answer that he thinks you want to hear just to get you off of his back. So one of the things that you could do in this case would be to let him know prior to asking the question that you're not going to be asking follow-up questions, or he's not going to be in trouble for the answer to the question. So you could say, I've got one question. I would like the answer to it. I promise not to follow that up with a dozen other questions, and I promise not to use your answer as an opportunity to get punitive or parental. So if he knows he's not going to be interrogated or criticized, he's going to be much more likely to answer your one question. If you're the type of person with high anxiety, you're constantly getting fooled into believing that there's something to be afraid of in the absence of real danger. Fear is when you're afraid of something and you know what it is. Anxiety, though, is when you're afraid of something but you don't know what it is. Anxiety is deceiving because when we feel discomfort, we get tricked into treating it like a real threat. But as the rational part of your brain knows, discomfort is not dangerous. When there is true danger at hand, we either freeze up, run, or fight back. If the threat looks faster and stronger than you, you may freeze up. If the threat looks stronger than you, but slower, you may run away from it. If the threat looks weaker than you, you may fight back. Unfortunately, for people on the autism spectrum, people are their main source of discomfort. And then their body gets tricked into believing that certain individuals are truly dangerous. And if this happens, they will either argue with the other person, which is fight, avoid the other person, which is flight, or they would feel intimidated by the other person, which is a form of freezing. Your natural instinct to protect yourself is what leads you to get deceived by anxiety. So why haven't you been able to see the pattern of repeated episodes of anxiety that never actually lead to a feared outcome? Since your worst case scenarios never come to fruition, why don't you gradually lose your unreasonable anxiety around these scenarios? Well, there's several reasons for this. You took protective steps and there was no disaster. Therefore, you started believing that these steps that you took saved you from disaster. But these steps that you took that supposedly saved you from disaster also cause you to worry more about the next dangerous episode. It convinces you that you were very vulnerable and must always protect yourself. The real reason you didn't experience a disaster is that such disasters are not part of fear or phobia. We're talking about anxiety disorders, not disaster disorders. You get through the experience because the experience isn't actually life-threatening, but it's justifiably hard for you to recognize that at the time. You may be more likely to think that you just had a narrow escape, and this leads you to redouble your self-protection steps. It's these self-protection steps that actually maintain and strengthen the deceptiveness of anxiety. If, for example, we think we just escaped a disaster because we went back and checked the stove 10 times, then we're going to continue to feel vulnerable and continue to feel the need for self-protection. When this happens over and over, we're going to get stuck in the habit of protecting ourselves by certain means. This is when chronic anxiety gets entrenched into our life. We think we're actually helping ourselves, but we're actually getting tricked into making things worse, and this is how deceptive anxiety is. For those of you who have chronic anxiety, you may have noticed that the harder you try to escape it, the worse it gets. The more you fight it, the more you're stuck with it. Thus, if the harder we try, the worse it gets, then what we need to do is to take another look at the protective steps we've been using. With high anxiety, we've been deceived into trying to protect ourselves against something that isn't dangerous, and this makes our anxiety worse over time. So what do we do instead? We allow ourselves to feel what we're feeling, as uncomfortable as it is. Know that this feeling of uncomfortableness will be short-lived and it will not be life-threatening. So you simply want to allow yourself to feel that emotional pain because, as I stated earlier, running from it makes it chase you. It will chase after you and bring out even more fear as you run for your life. Hey guys, this is Mark Hutten with AdultAspergersChat.com, and today I have a message for men on the autism spectrum who are married to a neurotypical wife, and I want to discuss with you briefly what I'm going to call the anxiety scale for risky conversations. Now, the reason I say risky conversations is because there's times when she wants to approach you and talk to you about something that's important to her, but it may be a little on the heavy side or loaded with some emotionality on her part, and so you are at risk of doing some version of a shutdown or a meltdown. And as she talks, the longer it goes, the more your anxiety comes up, and so we want to let her know, you want to let her know on a scale of 1 to 5 where your anxiety is. So the anxiety scale ranges from 1 to 5, 1 being very low anxiety with 5 being very high. Now, you'll want to use this scale when she's talking to you about important and perhaps even stressful topics. So as she is delivering her message, you are keeping a check on your anxiety level and where you're at on that scale, 1 being low, 5 being high. Now, when you feel that in your estimation you've hit a level 3, you are going to have difficulty listening, understanding, and retaining her information, and you're going to be at risk of experiencing some version of a meltdown or shutdown or false agreement. False agreement is simply when you agree with her just to hurry up and get the conversation over with. So at level 3, it would be best for you to call a timeout, but let her know this is not a shutdown. You can say, I'm at a level 3, I'm having a hard time retaining your information. Your information is important to you, so it's important to me too, but I need to take a brief timeout so I can get back down to level 1 on my anxiety scale. Okay, so you're letting her know this is a timeout, not a shutdown, and we will resume this discussion. Now, this is going to help you avoid shutdowns and meltdowns because it breaks up her sometimes rather large message into smaller, more manageable bite-sized chunks. So let's say you've hit level 3. You let her know, I'm not tracking your information very well now. Let me go take a timeout. I'll come back when I'm at level 1. You come back down to level 1. You let her know, I'm ready to continue this conversation. And when you come back for round 2, if you hit level 3 again, just repeat the process. As long as she knows that this is a timeout designed to help you listen, understand, and retain her message, she's probably going to be open to that. As long as she knows this is not an excuse to have a shutdown and to avoid the topic. There's never a great reason to bring up the past, unless, of course, it's to reflect on a positive memory, something that the two of you did together that was pleasant. Short of that, however, bringing up the past basically poisons the present moment. Think of a moment in time. It's less than a second in length, right? So this video is only a few seconds old at this point. There's been dozens of moments within this time frame already. So the moment is less than a second in length. But when you bring up the past, look at the lengthy history of the past. It could be 5, 10 years, 20 years, 25 years. So when you bring up the past, you're dragging a very lengthy recollection of pain into the current moment. When you bring up the past, you experience content memory, which is the hurtful things that were said and done. You also experience emotional memory. In other words, how you felt during the incident in question. So when you bring up the past, which is years old at this point, you're overloading the present moment, toxifying it. Think of it like this. You're eating a bowl of soup with the appropriate amount of sodium, but you decide you're going to take the whole salt shaker and dump the whole thing in there. Now you've contaminated it. There's no way you could eat it. It would make you sick if you did. So when you bring up the past, you're dragging in decades of hurt into the present moment. And where does that get you? What have you actually achieved doing that? In most cases, you have just created yet another painful memory. So when you bring up the hurtful things of the past, you're going to remember what was said and done. You're going to remember how you felt. It's going to instantly open up old wounds, and you have toxified or overloaded the current moment. You have dumped years of misery into a few seconds. Never any great reason to bring up the past. So guys, one of the complaints that your NT wife might have is that you don't engage in give and take in conversation. She may be sitting there in the same room as you and say something, and then you don't respond because you're not sure if it's something you should respond to. You may be thinking, well, that wasn't a question. It was just a random statement that doesn't require any kind of response from me. So here's the deal, guys. Anytime she says something, she's wanting a response. Every time she says something, it would be helpful if you would respond. And if you want to go the extra mile, not only just respond to her statement, but try to keep the conversation going. So if she makes a statement and you think it's just a random comment that does not even really requiring a response, it requires a response. So respond, go the extra mile, and try to stretch that out into an actual give and take of conversation. You can ask an inquiring question to keep the conversation going. I cannot express to you guys how much this is important, because this is one of the main things that gets in the way of her feeling like she's getting emotional reciprocity. She will say, well, I say something to him, I get no response. Just silence. I get the silent treatment a lot, talking to myself. I might as well be a potted plant sitting in the corner with no opinions and no wants, needs, desires, expectations, and so on. So you have your assignment. You get it? Okay, then do it. He knows that he sucks at social skills because he probably learned that as a child. And so if you were a little kid and your parents signed you up for Little League or T-ball or whatever, and you just didn't have the knack for that, and you got benched, you just basically sucked. So you ended up kind of being the bat boy, and it was a terrible experience. I'm never playing baseball again. I suck at that. I was never any good at it. They started me way out in the outfield, and then the coach wasn't even happy with me way out there, and he just benched me, and I just sat on the bench the entire season. So now that I have been benched by the coach, and I know that I'm not a good baseball player, and then somebody comes along and says, oh, well, would you like to join this team and learn how to play baseball? It's like, no, I've already been around that block. I suck at it. No. I don't have any interest in learning baseball or learning how to be a better pitcher or a better batter. And I'm perfectly fine not playing baseball. And so that's exactly what's going on with your husband, is that he knows he's terrible at it. He's had a bad experience with it. And talking is a social activity. Of course he doesn't want to talk. And it's a shame that he feels that way, because social skills can be taught. And the give and take in conversation can be taught. And he would actually get to the point where he probably enjoy conversing and enjoy talking, because he's actually doing it fairly adeptly for the first time in his life. So he might even find some joy in having conversation about something other than his topic of interest. The two of you are wired so differently that it makes perfect sense why you would have this conflict. He's speaking French, you're speaking German. And that sets up all kind of problems because with some of his traits, mind blindness, alexithymia, weak central coherence, some executive function deficit, he is wired such that her conversation style, which is very social and very emotional, raises his anxiety. And so he can't, for a variety of reasons that we will get into, it's hard for him to listen to a difficult conversation about the relationship problems. Since it causes so much anxiety, he engages in anxiety reduction, which could be meltdown, shutdown, pretending to listen but not really. There's a variety of things. And then she views that as he doesn't care about the relationship. I'm not important. He's insensitive, selfish, narcissistic, and all of that. So not to sound blaming to the NT's wives in here, but your assessments of why he did or didn't do certain things or did or didn't say certain things was in many cases way off base. And he's way off base in his assessments of you as well, because with mind blindness, as some of you probably know, he, and I'm speaking in general terms here, has a hard time of peeling himself out of his skin, climbing behind her eyeballs, and looking through her perception of things and getting a good grasp on why she thinks the way she does and why she feels the way she does and why she behaves the way she does and why she has certain opinions and perspectives. He can't do that. He can't put himself in your shoes and imagine what you might be thinking or feeling or why you have a certain opinion about stuff. And so since he's not sure, he will tend to fill in the blank with something just because he wants to try to make sense of her, and he always misses the mark. And it's even slightly worse than that because he will tend to fill in the blank not only with a false assumption but with a negative spin, and will assign kind of negative connotations on her motive. It's not uncommon for things to get a little worse initially. You would think, oh my God, it's already bad enough, and now that we're going to work on some things, it's going to get worse. Don't be surprised. In fact, I might be so bold as to say it would be likely, because she has kind of learned how to deal with you guys. I'm not saying it was functional, but she certainly has learned how to deal with you, and you have learned to deal with her. I'm not saying it was necessarily a healthy way to deal with her, but you have established some kind of a habit, probably a very dysfunctional habit. And now you're going to shift gears. So that's really going to upset the apple cart. If you've been used to driving around in your car on 3 wheels, and 1 wheel is just driving on the brake drum, you have learned how to adjust that car and kind of get by. And now you're going to put the wheel back on it again. It's going to take a little while before you realize, okay, well, now I got to go back to driving, normal like type thing. So I hope that made some sense. Anyway, don't be discouraged if you have setbacks. In fact, I would go so far as to say, when you have these setbacks, and you said you've had a few that really almost, was quite a bump in the road, those are perfect opportunities to practice. You can't come to group and go, okay, well, we have these recommendations, so now we're going to try this and it's going to go perfectly. Of course, that's not going to happen. You know that. But what you may not be thinking of is, okay, well, when we do hit a real nasty bump, instead of going, oh, and beating up on ourselves, I thought we had this down, we were doing so much better for so long, we feel like we're back to square one. Instead of all that shit, you're going to stop, hey, okay, great. We're still practicing. This is a great opportunity to use this as a learning opportunity. If you wanted to learn how to golf and you never golfed before, and then you went out to the golf course and you were terrible at it, but you kept practicing, and then you got really good, and you thought, I think I have this thing down. And then one day, you thinking you've got it all down, go and have a terrible game, balls all over the place, and like, I feel like I'm starting over. So you have some bad times, and you learn from those opportunities. They're not setbacks, they're setups for a practice. It is a developmental disorder, which simply means that developmentally, the social and emotional part of the brain is underdeveloped. You could think of it as a deficit in emotional literacy and social skills, with one huge caveat. Pay attention. a deficit in emotional literacy and social skills, but almost exclusively when he's trying to relate to his significant other. With his coworkers, and they're talking about perhaps his work is his special interest, he's talking to his coworkers, they don't know if he has ASD or not. The neighbors, they won't know. His friends that he bowls with or golfs with, they would have no clue. Why would you be the one to have the clue? Because his social and emotional weaknesses reveal themselves when he's in a situation where he has to be firing on all 8 cylinders, but he doesn't have 8 cylinders. I'm not saying he doesn't have any empathy or doesn't know anything about emotions or doesn't have any social skills. No, he does, but he's at his weakest with you. And if that's not the truth, neither one of you would be here. The whole point of doing this little backdrop is nobody did anything wrong. She, the NT wife, is wired to be connective, bonding, nurturing, emotional, etc. The guy on the autism spectrum is almost wired 180 degrees opposite of that. He's task-oriented. He's low in social and emotional needs. He's highly logical. So that's why we have this issue. So it would be great unless the resentment is so deep that you just can't bring yourself to doing it, in which case I'm not going to be judgmental. It would be best for the neurodiverse couple to extend one another a little grace and mercy given the dynamics at play. If you're in a neurodiverse marriage, you have probably noticed that you have a hard time resolving conflict, and the problems pile up in the closet, and they've been piling up for how long? Several years, decades. And so the reason that you're having a hard time resolving some of these marital issues are as follows. I have discovered in years of counseling couples that the main reason you don't resolve problems is because you try to fight too many problems at once. How's that been working for you? You haven't even been able to resolve one problem, let alone 3 or 4 at one time. Come on now. So the first order of business here to get you started on resolving conflict is for the two of you to sit down and pick a problem and try to address that one only. Which brings me to my second point. The two of you need to treat these conflict resolution moments as a business meeting. So that's point number 2. You're going to have a business meeting. You're going to treat one another the same way you would a coworker at work. You're going to then come up with one problem that the two of you agree is one of the top 3 problems. That's 3 things now, people. Pay attention. Just create a business meeting. The two of you are going to agree on a problem that lies in the top 3, and you're only going to work on that one problem for now. The other thing that gets in the way is the two of you will tend to want to try to resolve a problem when you're already mad. Dumb idea. That's point number 4. Only have this business meeting where you're addressing one problem that the two of you agreed is in the top 3 of all the problems. You're only going to discuss this when you're calm. Now we have 4 points now. Are you paying attention? The 5th point. We said we're going to conduct this like a business meeting. There's this thing called taking notes. You want to write this stuff down because you won't remember what you said next week. And somebody's going to say, no, I didn't say that, or no, we didn't agree to that, or when did we talk about that part? Write it down. So that when one party says, no, I didn't say that, or we didn't talk about that, you go to the notes of the meeting, you look and you go, see, yeah, we did talk about that, we did say this, we said exactly this, and we wrote it down, and you agreed to such and such. Write it down. You need proof, you need accountability, you need something that will help you to remember what the hell you said. Now, I understand this isn't a problem-solving strategy in and of itself, but at least it begins the process. If you can't even begin the process, then you're getting nowhere fast. So let me recap. Pay attention. You're going to make a business meeting. You're going to take notes. The two of you are going to agree on what the main problem, or at least one of the top 3 main problems are. And you're only going to deal with that one. You know, the family is a business in a sense. You're, in many cases, if not most cases, you're raising children. You're trying to keep a household. You're paying bills. You're maintaining property and vehicles. It's a business in the fullest sense of the term, if you think about it. And so when you're trying to resolve marital issues, and the two of you are partners in this business, you have to treat it like a business. And people in the business meeting don't go into the meeting talking about how they feel about things. They don't go in expressing anger, resentment. They don't go in throwing blame. They try to be politically correct. They try to be open to compromise. They try not to offend anybody because they want their points to be well taken and they want their goals to be accepted. And so they present their case very tactfully, as should you. If you will do these things, I can promise you at least the two of you can get to the table and start discussing some things. I get questions from NT partners, and most often it's the wife, and they're often asked questions in the area of what are some of the traits that I need to know about in my husband or wife, as the case may be, with Asperger's or high function autism, that get in the way of relationships. Is there any particular traits that I need to be really aware of? And there are. To help you understand your spouse or partner on the autism spectrum, just know that many of them turn their emotions way down, not off, but way down. And it comes from many years of emotions getting in the way of their logical way of thinking, okay? It's not that they don't have any room for emotions, it's just in their mind there isn't any need for emotions. Many people on the spectrum believe that emotions just get in the way of completing tasks because they are very task-oriented. They're more interested in things and tasks than they are in people. You could even think of their motto as being remove the emotions and accomplish the task more efficiently. So why does that cause a problem in the relationship? Because it should be painfully obvious that they're not going to tune into how they feel so much, and they're certainly not going to tune into how you feel. And if you try to tell them, well, I feel this way about that, and this hurt me, or whatever, and you expect him to take how you feel and apply it to a task he's supposed to complete, it's going to be a mismatch. The other thing that occurs oftentimes with people on the autism spectrum is they have challenges in understanding or predicting the consequences of their behavior on others. So they may say or do things that are hurtful. It's not their intention. Of course, I know there's the difference between intention and impact, but they will often say or do something. She will get upset, and he won't know why, but he will view her as being irrational, illogical, and overly emotional. Also keep in mind that since they have mind blindness issues and alexithymia issues, and if you need more information on that, just email me. My email is mbhutton@gmail.com. So since they have the mind blindness and alexithymia stuff going on, they view talking about the relationship problems as almost intolerable. They have a very difficult time hearing your negative emotions because they would view, I'm talking to the NTs here, they would view your different opinion or your attempt to explain a different perspective about a situation as criticism and you trying to start a fight. So when you have tried to explain things to him about a particular issue that you wanted to address, you may have found that you didn't get very far because you felt personally attacked. Another thing that causes problems in relationships that is a trait is to them, to people on the spectrum, routines are paramount. They find great comfort in routine and structure, and they don't like change, and they will be very stressed out if you try to surprise them or change them in any way. And then the other big thing is they're, as I mentioned earlier, they're more task-oriented rather than relationship-oriented. So their motto is kind of tasks first, relationships second. So if you have often had the thought that my husband with Asperger's, for example, he's more interested in his work or his special interest than me. Those things are more important to him than I am. So if you run into that, then you know what I'm talking about tasks first and relationships second. The other one and the last one that I'll talk about in this video in an attempt to help you to understand your spouse with AS or high functioning autism is you may have run into a situation where they always have to be right and or they always have to make you wrong. So and actually we're back to the mind blindness thing. So be sure to research that. If you go to adultaspergerschat.com, I have a bunch of information on that. So if I have this disorder called Asperger's or high functioning autism, this is a developmental disorder, which means that my social emotional brain is underdeveloped relative to my logical brain. And to complicate matters even worse, my logical brain is overly developed, which is a problem because now I can get stuck in analysis. I can get hooked on a thought, and it's hard for me to move from thought to action. So in other words, my social intelligence and my emotional intelligence is low, and my logic is too high. In fact, you could think of high functioning autism literally as a disorder of social skills, because it takes a lot of social and emotional intelligence to have well-defined social skills, obviously. So as a result of having this low-functioning social emotional brain, I have this thing called mind blindness. In other words, I have a hard time predicting what might be in the mind of my partner or spouse. I have a hard time imagining what they might be thinking or feeling. So I truly have no clue how the other person feels and thinks. So as a result, when they have a perspective or opinion that's different from mine, I can't wrap my brain around their perspective. I can't, in a sense, peel myself out of my body and crawl into her body and look through her eyes and see things through her lens. So if I have this mind blindness, her viewpoint makes utter nonsense to me. So since I'm blind to her perspective, I will tend to view her differing opinion as she's disagreeing with me. She's trying to argue with me, which is a thinking error. So I make this thinking error because she is disagreeing with me, therefore she's against me. I make that leap of logic right there. So then I continue with another thinking error. Because she's against me, I have to defend myself and prove that she's wrong and illogical and overly emotional. If I don't make her wrong, that means I'm wrong because only one person can be right. And that must be me, since my perception is the only perception I can see. Emphasis on see, because I have mind blindness and I can't see hers. So in other words, since I can't comprehend her thoughts or feelings, her thoughts and feelings are not valid. Okay? So it's like, think of color blindness perhaps, where I'm colorblind, I have the Asperger's, and I'm colorblind, I only see in shades of gray. And the NT wife, for example, she sees this rich mosaic picture and she's pointing out all the colors. And she says, blue, red, well, look at that pretty turquoise and that. And I'm going, no, that's just all gray. And then we get into this argument because I have my filter and she has her filter. And since I can't see through her eyes and see all the different colors, I just assumed quite honestly that she's just a nutcase and doesn't even know what she's talking about. And I totally invalidate her opinion at that point.
Hey guys, this is Mark Hutten with AdultAsperger'sChat.com, and I got another email from a neurotypical wife regarding her Asperger's husband, and she is wanting to know how she can know the difference between Asperger's traits versus pure unadulterated insensitivity. So what she's wanting to know is she understands that her husband has special needs and that he's going to have certain traits that are hardwired and are fixed and are going to be difficult to change, and she's wanting to know how she can tell the difference between these traits that come with the disorder, in which case she would need to give him a break, versus him just being purely selfish, uncaring and insensitive? Well, that's going to be a difficult question to answer because everybody with Asperger's syndrome or high-functioning autism is different, and so the traits manifest differently given the person, and also it varies from situation to situation. But most Asperger's related behavior, sometimes misinterpreted by the NT spouse or partner as insensitivity, tends to revolve around the Asperger's individual's resistance to any kind of change. So it would be helpful to think in terms of when your husband is like really super resistant to any type of change, that's usually a sign that it's related to an Asperger's trait. So an Asperger's individual is resistant to change for many reasons. For example, he has anxiety about a current or upcoming event. Due to mind blindness, he has a general misunderstanding of how the real world works. He tends to have difficulty understanding the actions and feelings of someone else. And your husband may have some other issues going on. A very prominent one is ADD. He may be resistant to change because he's reluctant to participate in an activity he can't do perfectly or an activity that is too difficult. Most people with Asperger's do have a strong need to control the situation, and they typically have difficulty transitioning to another activity, especially if the current activity is not finished. So any or all of these triggers can result in certain behavioral patterns that look like insensitivity and selfishness. For example, he may argue, he may have an adult tantrum, he may melt down, he may refuse to listen to you, he may pout, and so on. But keep in mind that Asperger's syndrome is a developmental disorder. So developmentally he is challenged, and what I mean by that, his social emotional brain is immature compared to his chronological age. Also, the triggers that I listed, these triggers have more to do with anxiety and rigidity than it does, just wanting to upset you or hurt you. The typical Asperger's brain does not take in what is going on around him. He's not able to read between the lines. He doesn't understand implied directions, doesn't understand social cues, doesn't understand facial expression or body language. And so all of this does kind of give the appearance as if he doesn't care, and in many cases it may give the appearance that he's purposely trying to be hurtful. So uncovering triggers for negative behaviors is very important. It would be good for him to keep a diary, or maybe you could keep the diary noting any events surrounding negative behaviors, the details of his responses, and so on. And this is not to get him off the hook. He's still responsible for his behavior, and having a developmental disorder is not a license to hurt other people. Having said that, people with Asperger's syndrome are often unable to resist giving into their obsessions and compulsions. Because they have difficulty interpreting social cues, they can come off as being egocentric. It's difficult for them to fully appreciate what impact their behaviors have on others, and due to trouble handling changes in routine, even a simple variation in your husband's schedule or routine may be enough to cause him to have a rage attack or a meltdown or a shutdown. So to summarize, when you're trying to decide the difference between Asperger's related behavior versus pure insensitivity that has nothing to do with the disorder, it would be helpful to think in terms of the fact that he is resistant to change, he prefers routine and predictability, and when that gets disrupted, his behavior that looks like insensitivity is probably mostly related to Asperger's syndrome. With mind blindness, you're not really sure what other people are feeling, what they're thinking, what their motives might be, and so they're always trying to guess what's going on with other people in the social realm. And this is very anxiety provoking. And so that's why they really love routine and predictability, to cut down on the guesswork involved with trying to figure out how people operate. So therefore they're very resistant to change, and they do have some dysfunctional coping mechanisms to deal with their anxiety around change that can look like insensitivity. Hope that answers your question. Thanks, and click on the link below for more information on this topic. Thanks, guys.
Hey guys, this is Mark Hutten with AdultAspergersChat.com, and today I want to look at executive functions deficits and how they may impact the relationship. So if you're a neurotypical partner and you are married to someone on the autism spectrum, you have no doubt run into some things that really fall under the category of executive function deficits, but you may have perceived it as he's just being rude, insensitive, uncaring, selfish, narcissistic, self-absorbed, and so on. So some of these things do look like inappropriate behavior, but what's really going on is the way that the ASD individual's brain is wired, and some of these things he has little control over. The first executive function is abstract thinking. Now, this is being able to understand non-literal language. For example, sarcasm, jokes, metaphors, and so on. It's also the ability to understand nonverbal communication, and that would be the way we get our message across apart from the words we use. Tone of voice, volume of voice, body language, facial gestures, and so on. So one example of abstract thinking deficit would be, let's say you, the NT partner, were purposely being sarcastic when you were talking to your ASD partner, and you thought it was obvious that you were being sarcastic, but he didn't get it, and he took you literally. Another example would be, let's say that you're upset with him over something, and to a typical person, it would be very clear that you're upset. Your facial cues, your body language, your volume and tone of voice conveys that you are upset and even disgusted. But when you talk to your husband in that state of mind, he doesn't realize that that's any different than talking about the weather. He's not picking up on your facial cues and some of the other things that would indicate to most people that you're upset, and that's just a neutral conversation in his mind. So another executive function is called emotional control, and this is the ability to control escalating emotions in order to complete a task and to keep emotions to a level that's appropriate. So I'm sure a lot of NT spouses out there have run into this one. If your ASD partner has a deficit in this area, then you have witnessed meltdowns, shutdowns, adult temper tantrums, and behavior that just in general was out of control and disproportionate to the actual event that was going on. So, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being a terrible problem and 1 being no problem, he responds to a level 3 problem as if it were a level 9 or 10. So the next executive function we'll look at is called inhibition, and that's the ability to contain the desire to do something in order to stay on task until it's finished. For example, staying focused long enough to complete a project, thinking through problem solving, staying on the topic, and avoiding going off on tangents. So an example of an inhibition deficit would be, let's say that you are talking to your ASD partner about topic 1, and you've made your delivery that lasted a couple minutes, and now you stop talking and you're waiting for him to respond, and he responds with topic B. It has nothing to do with what you just said. So you get the indication that A, he didn't hear what I said, and B, this whole time he's more concerned about what's going on in his mind than what's going on in my mind. So, you're talking about topic A. When you're done talking, he shifts the conversation to a completely different topic. The next executive function is initiating, and this is getting started on a task. For example, knowing where to start, what to do next, and so on. So with the ASD brain, the logical part of the brain is overly developed, and so that's an overthinking brain. In other words, they get stuck on a particular thought and they can't move forward from the thinking process or the planning process to the action phase. It's not uncommon for the AS individual to want to have all of his ducks perfectly in a row before he moves forward. And so since he is very perfectionistic, and since it's very difficult to do anything perfectly, often the result is he procrastinates. He will say, if I can't do this perfectly, I'm not going to do it at all. And if there is some process that involves 5 different steps, he will tend to get stuck on the first or second step during the planning phase and then fail to complete the task or the project. The next executive function is multitasking. That kind of speaks for itself. That is the ability to carry out more than one cognitive process at a time. For example, being able to perform a task while talking. And so if you've ever tried to have a discussion with your ASD partner while he was in the middle of playing a computer game or something, when you talked to him about something that was important to you, it most likely didn't go in one ear and out the other. It never went in the one ear. The next executive function is planning and organizing. This is the ability to plan and organize time, information, and procedures efficiently. For example, carrying out instructions accurately, completing tasks on time and correctly, and so on. So with this one, remember that people on the autism spectrum are visual learners in a verbal world. And so if you've ever given your ASD partner a fairly lengthy list of things to do, or you've tried to describe something that had multiple steps and he couldn't paraphrase back what you just said because he didn't really get it, it's because he had data overload. In other words, there was just too many bits of information for him to be able to retain at one time. And next, we have self-monitoring. This is being mindful. It's recognizing when a change is needed, and it's noticing when an error occurs. For example, staying on a topic when talking, noticing changes of topics in groups, answering questions accurately, noticing when you have made a mistake, being relatively accurate in your judgment of your own and others' behavior. So with this self-monitoring deficit, what goes on here is basically the mind blindness problem, where I don't know how my behavior impacts others, and also I don't understand your side of things. I don't understand why you say and do the things that you do. Shifting focus is another executive function, and this is the ability to shift attention if something changes. For example, being able to change how something is being done when asked, being able to see multiple possible solutions to a problem. So if you're in a relationship with an ASD partner, you have probably found out that he does not like change and he does not like surprises. And if he was busy doing something and you come in and interrupt him because you need him to do something else, you've probably noticed he had a hard time shifting from task A to task B. And lastly, we have working memory. Now, this is the ability to hold on to information in order to process it. For example, being able to identify the main point, being able to take all information into account, being able to tell a cohesive story in a logical sequence, following instructions, reading comprehension, all of these things have to do with working memory. So an example of a working memory deficit would be, let's say that you have given your ASD partner some instructions. You needed him to do something and complete a particular task, and he gives you the indication that he both listened and understood you, but you find out eventually that he really didn't because he simply didn't follow through. So these are the 9 different executive functions, and it is not uncommon for the ASD individual who has a deficit in one or more of these areas to be viewed by his partner as neglectful, irresponsible, lazy, and so on. So a lot of times these deficits do get misinterpreted. In other words, they may be viewed as behavior that was intentionally malicious.
So many people with Asperger's syndrome and high-functioning autism have this condition called alexithymia, which I simply refer to as emotional blindness. Many of you who have researched autism have heard of mind blindness, and I won't go into that in this video, although there will be a link underneath this video that will direct you to more information on mind blindness. But in this video, we're really talking about emotional blindness. So what I mean by that is, if I have alexithymia, I'm not really sure how I feel, and I have a problem putting my feelings into some type of a vocabulary. I also have trouble reading other people's emotions or understanding what they're referring to when they're actually talking about their emotions. So since I'm kind of in the dark with respect to emotions, both in myself and others, I prefer talking to people about their daily activities and about facts and tasks rather than feelings. So if I have alexithymia, I have difficulty communicating or describing emotions to others, so it's difficult for me to find the right words for my feelings. And since it's awkward conversation for me, the feelings conversation, I tend to want to shy away from those conversations. It's especially problematic for me in the case where I have a neurotypical spouse and she wants to talk to me about how she feels, and it's a double whammy for me so to speak, when she wants to talk to me about how she feels with respect to the problems we're having in the relationship. So now I'm really in a conversation that I don't want to have. Also, when I'm in a conversation with my spouse about feelings and about problems in the relationship, I have feelings that I can't quite identify. So honestly, I can't even have an emotionally intelligent conversation with my neurotypical wife because she's really speaking French and I simply don't know how to speak French. In fact, alexithymia literally means no words for feelings. So if I have the inability to understand the intricacies of feelings and emotions, and I have difficulty trying to name, understand, and talk about feelings, I'm either going to avoid conversations where I'm required to talk about how somebody else feels and how I feel, or if I do try to have that conversation, I'm probably going to do it very poorly, which I then run the risk of coming off to the other individual as insensitive, uncaring, selfish, lacking empathy and sympathy, and maybe even come off as being somewhat narcissistic. So alexithymia is not just a lack of interest in emotional connection. It's a lack of desire to engage in emotional connection because I struggle with it so much. And that's frustrating to me. But unfortunately, it's also frustrating to the person that wants to connect with me at an emotional level, and I simply can't or don't. Some of the symptoms of alexithymia would be a narrow capacity to understand the reasons behind certain emotions, heightened sensitivity to physical touch, which causes a real problem in the area of intimacy with my significant other, struggling to identify emotions expressed by others, difficulty with naming different kinds of emotions, indifference towards other people, and in some cases saying or doing something that others perceive as highly inappropriate because I simply don't have the emotional intelligence to filter some of the things that I may say or do that may be hurtful to others. Another interesting and unfortunate manifestation of alexithymia is, since I'm not in tune with my emotions, that doesn't mean that the emotion isn't there. It just means that I can't identify it very well with the emotional part of my brain. So what ends up happening is I tend to get physical symptoms of the emotion that's not getting expressed properly. In other words, I have a particular feeling that I can't express in a functional way, and so my body ends up expressing that feeling in perhaps a dysfunctional way. For example, a person who is very angry yet doesn't know how to express their anger might develop a stomach ache or a headache or an ulcer. A person who is very anxious but can't identify that they're in a state of anxiety might develop high blood pressure. They may slip into rage, meltdowns, and even shutdowns. The treatment options for alexithymia are usually very different from typical counseling or talk therapy. The therapist who has an expertise in this area will most likely concentrate on building a foundation of naming emotions and appreciating a range of emotions. Or more broadly, the process will involve helping the individual grow their emotional intelligence. Hey guys, this is Mark Hutten with AdultAspergersChat.com, and I wanted to take a deep dive into explaining this business of mind blindness and why it can cause problems in relationships. So this will get a little on the technical side. So the Diagnostic Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders defines 6 key domains of cognitive function, and they are social cognition, perceptual motor function, learning and memory, language, executive function, and complex attention. Now, mind blindness, which in essence is the opposite of empathy, is a cognitive disorder in which the person with Asperger's or high-functioning autism is unable to, or finds it very difficult to, predict the mental states of others. For example, their thoughts, beliefs, emotions, desires, behaviors, intentions, and so on. Now, it's not necessarily caused by an inability to imagine an answer, but it is often due to an inability to gather enough information to decipher which of the many possible answers is correct. And this is referred to as an empathetic cognitive deficit. Now, empathy is usually divided into two major components. There's cognitive empathy, and that's the ability to understand another's perspective or mental state. And then there's affective empathy, which is the ability to respond with an appropriate emotion to another's mental state. Now, cognitive and affective empathy are also independent from one another. For example, you may not be very good at understanding another person's perspective, but you may be very good at empathizing with other people. So people on the autism spectrum have deficits in both cognitive and affective empathy. Okay, so now I want to look at the subcategories of both cognitive and affective empathy. Cognitive empathy can be subdivided into three categories. There's tactical or strategic empathy, which is the deliberate use of perspective taking to achieve certain desired ends. Then there is perspective taking, which is the tendency to spontaneously adopt another person's psychological perspective. And then there's fantasy, which is the tendency to identify with fictional characters. Now, there is two categories that can be subsumed under affective empathy, and they are personal distress, which is possessing feelings of discomfort and anxiety in response to another's suffering. And then there's empathic concern, which is having compassion for others in response to their suffering. So mind blindness is a state where the ability to make automatic interpretations of events, taking into consideration the mental states of people, their desires, and beliefs, has not been developed or is lost in the person on the autism spectrum. So can you imagine living with a disorder in which you can't perceive or interpret the behavior of others? For example, their needs and desires, their feelings, beliefs, their goals, purposes. All of these things are a total mystery to you. The higher their anxiety goes, the worse the mind blindness, and the more difficulty they're going to have with interpersonal relationships and all the emotional nuances that come with relationships. So the social and cognitive impairments seen in people on the autism spectrum can be attributed to mind blindness. Let me repeat that. The social and cognitive impairments seen in people on the autism spectrum can be attributed to mind blindness. The abnormal behavior of these individuals includes a lack of reciprocity, difficulty empathizing with others, being totally withdrawn from social settings, especially under high stress, sometimes not being able to make eye contact, and again, if the anxiety is high, they have little to no desire to interact with other people, which we call social detachment. Hey guys, this is Mark Hutten with AdultAspergersChat.com, and I got an email from a neurotypical wife, and she's asking a question about her Asperger's husband. And she states, you talk about how the Asperger's brain is wired differently. So what is it about my husband's brain that is wired so differently that he seems totally unable to understand how I feel? Okay, well, first of all, I doubt that he totally doesn't understand how you feel, but he may give you the impression that he has no clue, and quite honestly, in many cases, he probably has no clue. So we need to look at two things really: mind blindness and alexithymia. Now, these are two traits that are often found in Asperger's and high-functioning autism. You can think of mind blindness as the inability to predict the beliefs and intentions of others, and you can think of alexithymia as the inability to identify and interpret emotional signals in others and also in one's self. And this in turn reduces the ability to be empathically attuned to others. So let's look at each of these in turn. We'll look at mind blindness first. So mind blindness is essentially the opposite of empathy, and it can be described as an inability to develop an awareness of what's in the mind of another person. The typical brain, for example, let's say you are talking to somebody and they have a certain facial expression and they have certain body language and they have a certain tone of voice, and you're weighing all that in conjunction with their actual words, and you may be able to be pretty good at predicting, how that person is feeling or what they're thinking or what their general attitude is. Well, people with mind blindness, they don't have that ability. So generally speaking, people with mind blindness are delayed in developing what is called a theory of mind. Another way of saying this is the person with mind blindness can't conceptualize, understand, or predict emotional states in other people. Now, alexithymia can be described as a state of deficiency in understanding, processing, or describing emotions. The person with alexithymia, they have trouble imagining outcomes. They have difficulty predicting how their behavior is going to impact others. They have trouble describing feelings to other people. They're not sure how they feel. They're not sure how you feel. They have difficulty identifying feelings and distinguishing between feelings and the bodily sensations associated with those feelings. Now, there's two kinds of alexithymia. There's what is called primary alexithymia, and we'll just call it an ongoing psychological trait that does not alter over time. And that speaks to the business of the Asperger's brain being hardwired. That is something that can't be fixed. But then there's secondary alexithymia, and that is a state-dependent situation. And it usually disappears after the evoking stressful situation has changed. So that second version of alexithymia depends on the situation. Now, the typical deficiencies that result from alexithymia, as I mentioned a little bit ago, can include a lack of imagination, lack of intuition, lack of empathy, and it also results in the person with Asperger's being more driven towards relating to objects and tasks rather than people. Additionally, it would be concrete, realistic, logical thinking, often to the exclusion of emotional responses to problems. You may find that your Asperger's man is highly logical. There's few dreams or fantasies due to this business of having a restricted imagination. They may treat themselves as robots. They have problems identifying, describing, and working with one's own feelings. And they have a real problem identifying, describing, and working with their partner's feelings. So alexithymia creates interpersonal problems because these individuals avoid emotionally close relationships, or if they do form relationships with others, they tend to position themselves in either a dependent, dominant, or impersonal position. And the reason they do that is because they want the relationship to remain superficial. A secondary issue related to alexithymia involves the inability to identify and modulate strong emotions. And that's usually, with the Asperger's man, anger. And so the inability to modulate emotions leaves the person prone to sudden affective outbursts such as rage, meltdowns, or in some cases, shutdowns. So if your situation is like most that I hear about, it's not uncommon for your husband to go into meltdowns. Looks like an adult version of a temper tantrum, raging and being very critical of you. So in most cases, the individual with Asperger's is having a lot of anxiety, and they want to release that anxiety because anxiety is nothing more than a bunch of pent-up, uncomfortable emotions. And so they tend to want to have a verbal vomit on their partner to discharge this uncomfortable, anxious feeling. And unfortunately, when they discharge their anger and their anxiety onto their partner, they feel better, but their partner now feels like shit, quite honestly, because they've been used as a scapegoat and a whipping post. Oftentimes when the Asperger's person goes into the meltdown or rage, they will report a feeling of being unwillingly detached from the world. In other words, they feel a disconnect, and it's like they didn't really volunteer for this disconnect. It can just look like a pure case of emotional abuse to the observer, but what's really going on is the Asperger's, in this case Asperger's man, is having a real internal struggle, and he's trying to figure out a way to discharge this anxiety, and unfortunately this is done in a very dysfunctional way. It's his destructive coping mechanism. Now, people with mind blindness and alexithymia, when they become an adult, they do have great difficulty finding a life partner or getting married due to poor social skills. Because if you have mind blindness and you're not really attuned to what other people might be feeling, and you struggle with empathy, and if you have alexithymia, which you're in a situation where you're almost overly logical, clearly you can understand why that would get in the way of social skills and a relationship is by definition exchanging social interaction. The complexity and inconsistency of the social world often poses extreme challenges to individuals with this mind blindness and alexithymia business. So that doesn't necessarily help you feel better, but it may help you understand the deficits that your husband has that appear to make him selfish, uncaring, insensitive. That's what it looks like, and that's what it feels like, and that's totally understandable. However, if you look deeper, you will realize that indeed there is some brain wiring that is different that prevents him from relating to you in a more loving, compassionate way. Oftentimes, when you see the ugly side of your husband, what's really going on inside him is he's struggling to comprehend what's going on in a problematic situation, and also dealing with the anxiety associated with not being able to comprehend what's going on in a social situation.
Since my social intelligence and emotional intelligence is low, I have a hard time reading body language, facial cues, tone of voice, volume of voice, filling in between the lines when somebody's somewhat vague. Since I have this mind blindness issue where I'm not really sure what people's motives are, I'm not really sure what's going on inside of their thinking process, I'm not really sure what they're feeling in their heart, I'm not really sure what they're planning. I have a hard time predicting outcomes based on this misinformation that I'm getting because I have this mind blindness thing. So what ends up happening is I'm always in a state of confusion because I never really totally know what the hell's going on. And I'm like dodging paintballs all day. I'm trying to figure out, okay, what is this person thinking, or what are they feeling? Is it my fault? Is it something else? And there's this guesswork that goes on all goddamn day long. And so since you're in a constant state of confusion and guesswork, as you well can imagine, causes a lot of anxiety. Because I never know what the hell's going on. I'm always trying to guess what's going on. So I am literally in a heightened state of anxiety to one degree or another. I'm never not anxious unless I'm engaging in my special interest. But for the most part, I'm in some form of anxiety all day long. What do I do when I'm anxious 24/7? I probably even have anxious dreams. So what do I do in that case? I engage in anxiety reduction. Since I'm anxious all the time, I do as many things as I know how to reduce my anxiety. But I have found in many cases the individual's anxiety reduction techniques at the very best only work temporarily, and in many cases not even temporarily. But in most cases, the anxiety reduction techniques, which would be anger, rage, shutdowns, meltdowns, whatever, I mean, the list is long. Their anxiety reduction technique actually increases the anxiety.
Hey guys, this is Mark Hutten with AdultAspergersChat.com, and today I want to talk about some of the traits of Asperger's syndrome that are pretty much hardwired. And if you are, for example, a neurotypical wife in a relationship with an Asperger's husband, you do want to pick your battles carefully, because some of the things that you may have viewed as selfish, uncaring, and insensitive may have been directly or indirectly related to some of the traits of the disorder. And these things can't be changed much, and they certainly can't be fixed or eliminated. It's possible that as much as 80% of the unwanted behavior that you have witnessed in your Asperger's husband was not intended to be hurtful. It wasn't malicious by design. I know that doesn't reduce your hurt, but it might help you take a few things less personally. Think of Asperger's as a disorder of insight into the thoughts and feelings of others. Let me repeat that. Asperger's can be viewed as a disorder of insight into the thoughts and feelings of others. Now, this is also called mind blindness. So issues that revolve around mind blindness are those issues that you need to put into the I can't fix that category. You have a category in your mind, the I can't fix it category, and you put mind blindness issues into that category. In other words, you don't want to waste a lot of time or energy trying to fix that. Honestly, it would be a whole lot easier and a whole lot less painful to simply go beat your head against a brick wall than to try to fix mind blindness issues. Because of mind blindness, it may be very difficult to engage your Asperger's husband in the types of dialogue that marriage and family therapists use. These professionals may not have dealt much with partners affected by Asperger's, and honestly, they may need information from you in order to avoid misunderstandings. If the truth be known, it may be more useful for you to talk to a therapist on your own in order to have a chance to think through your feelings and decide what might be some effective coping techniques in dealing with an Asperger's partner. As an NT spouse, you have a highly developed social emotional brain. You easily pick up on facial cues, body language, innuendos, sarcasm. You can kind of predict outcomes. Your Asperger's husband does not have those skills. He is a person who is a visual thinker in a verbal world. And with mind blindness, he doesn't pick up on how he feels, how other people feel. And if you speak to him in terms of feelings, for example, I feel this way about such and such, and you expect him to take how you feel and apply that to an action that he's supposed to take, it's never going to happen. So save yourself the grief and just bypass that whole scenario. Don't talk to him in terms of how you feel. Instead, talk to him in terms of what you need. Be concrete. Just tell him what you need. I need your help with blah, 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 blah. And you're going to fill in the blank with something. Just cut to the chase, okay? Because of mind blindness, he doesn't want things to change. He wants everything to stay the same. He doesn't like surprises. Structure is super important to him. So he's going to need plenty of notice up front when such disruptions are going to occur. Also, understand that all the unwritten rules of behavior are very confusing to your Asperger's husband. Something that you think is obvious is not going to be obvious to him. People with Asperger's syndrome may not be able to project their mind into a hypothetical situation or put themselves in someone else's shoes. They oftentimes do not recognize the needs of others, and it's not because they're purposely trying to be selfish or insensitive. Rather, it's that their social emotional brain is underdeveloped. Asperger's syndrome is a developmental disorder. So when communicating with your Asperger's spouse, don't be vague or assume your wishes will be acknowledged and understood. For example, it may not be enough to remind him that you're having family over for dinner. You may need to go through the entire evening in great detail. For example, I need you to help me with this, or I want you to greet everyone as they arrive, or I would really appreciate it if you didn't go to bed before the guests leave, and so on. So understand that in many cases, the Asperger's individual is simply not going to get better or be transformed into the husband that you thought you married. Even so, certain behavior can be modified or changed, which can make daily life less stressful for you. For example, establishing routines and agreeable timetables, looking at how you talk to him and what language is used. So it's not just a hopeless case here. There are things that can be done. If you're interested in a program that can teach you some of the things that can be done, there's a link below. Also, if you would be interested in couples counseling, either by yourself or with your spouse, there's a link below this video that will direct you toward that resource as well. Thanks, guys. Mark Hutten, AdultAspergersChat.com.
So now we want to look at why people on the autism spectrum tend to prefer their special activity to spend time and energy with that as opposed to spending time and energy with their special person, which in this case would be their neurotypical spouse. So if I have autism spectrum disorder, by default, I have this thing called mind blindness. Simply put, it's hard for me to predict what might be in the mind of other individuals, what they might be thinking, and that creates a cascade of problems because now, if I don't understand how they think, I also don't understand why they say and do the things they do. I don't understand their motives. I don't understand their perspectives, and so I'm lost in that regard. Also with ASD, If I am wired that way, I have alexithymia, which means that I have, in addition to mind blindness, I have emotions blindness. I don't understand how I feel. I don't understand how other people feel. I don't get the connection between their facial cues, body language, and how they're feeling. I don't get the connection between their tone of voice, volume of voice, wordage, and how that connects to their feelings. So there again, I'm lost. So being so out of touch with others in the social and emotional sense creates a lot of unpredictability in my life. I don't understand how I feel. I don't understand how you feel. I don't understand how you think, why you behave the way you do, why you say the things you do. I'm so out of the loop that I live 24/7, 365 days a year in some state of unpredictability. And this chronic low-grade unpredictability that manifests at home, in the workplace, and otherwise creates mild low-grade anxiety in me 24/7, 365 days a year. So living a life of chronic low-grade anxiety puts me in a position to want to reduce that anxiety. So I come up with a host of anxiety reduction strategies. That's going to be some version of a meltdown, mild to severe, and or some version of a shutdown, mild to severe. Or I may engage in false agreement. In other words, I just give you the indication that I'm going along with what you want and what you're saying, just basically to get you to stop talking to me and end the conversation because it's getting too stressful. But one of the most important things that I do with this chronic low-grade anxiety due to so much unpredictability in my life is I create a lot of structure and routine. Since things are so unpredictable, I try to make them as predictable as I can, and that is through providing myself with a set of routines, a set of rules, a certain structure that I must abide by to keep my anxiety at bay. And one of the best ways that I can achieve this business of routine and structure is to find an activity that I enjoy and become totally hyper-focused and engrossed in that activity. Because now I have super predictability and I have super anxiety reduction when I am totally absorbed and mesmerized by and in my special interest. Whether that's my work or some hobby or some computer game, you name it. There's a multitude of different things there. So this creates a problem for me socially because now the people that supposedly want to connect with me have a great difficulty connecting with me because I'm gone. I'm spending more time and energy and more passion with my special interest than with my special person or my special people. And they feel left out, ignored, disrespected. They view me as being selfish, uncaring, insensitive, narcissistic, and even sociopathic. And they feel emotionally deprived. She may even claim that she has Cassandra syndrome. All of this is not what I want, and it raises my anxiety even more, which makes me engage in my special activity even more, which creates more distance between me and my special person or my special people, and which makes me in turn want to spend more time with my special activity. So in summary, my spending a lot of quality time with my object of preference, which is probably nothing to do with anything social, is my structure, my routine, my anxiety reduction strategy. So I have a chronic special interest to deal with my chronic anxiety. So if I have ASD, I'm going to have a lot of routine and structure, which means I'm going to have a lot of rules. I'm going to be the type of person that wants things to be done in a certain way at a certain time. I don't want my routine interrupted. I don't want to have to shift my focus from what I'm doing now to tending to somebody else's needs or wants or desires. So I'm going to be very rule-oriented. I'm going to be super resistant to any kind of change, especially unexpected change. And when my routine gets interrupted, that's when my anxiety comes up, and that's when the significant people in my life are probably going to witness me doing some version of a meltdown or a shutdown. So in this way, a meltdown or a shutdown or a combination thereof is really nothing more than anxiety overload, which in turn means I'm going to soon go back to reducing that anxiety, which means I'm back to my special interest again. So in a nutshell, my special activity is always highly predictable, whereas my special person is most often highly unpredictable.
Hey guys, this is Mark Hutten with AdultAspergersChat.com, and I wanted to respond to this email from a neurotypical wife. And she says, why is it that my husband with Asperger's syndrome prefers his special interest and work over a relationship with me? In order to answer that question, we first need to take a deep dive and look at the concept of weak predictive ability. So if one has the ability to predict, he or she can come up with an educated guess about what might happen in the near or distant future, that is, some outcome is expected. But this ability is not necessarily based on experience or knowledge. Prediction is a skill that allows us to generalize, that is, since the occurrence of situation A resulted in outcome B, then a situation similar to A will likely result in an outcome similar to B. For example, after observing enough moving objects, a person can understand momentum and, through generalizing, predict the position of a moving target in the near future. So what does this have to do with your husband with Asperger's syndrome? Well, people with Asperger's and high-functioning autism have poor predictive abilities. That is, they have great difficulty predicting future events. Another function of prediction is to fill in missing information. For example, if the driver in front of you veers his car sharply to the left and then to the right, you might predict that he swerved in order to avoid hitting something in the road. Thus, the Asperger's individual's impaired predictive ability means impaired filling in of missing information for perception and action. So, what does weak predictive ability have to do with the fact that your husband prefers his special interests or he prefers work as opposed to relationships? Well, since these individuals have to live every day with the uncertainty inflicted by their poor predictive skills, they tend to favor relatively predictable and precise events and tasks. As a result, they prefer objects, they prefer non-social tasks, which are more predictable, instead of with people, which are less predictable. And I think you would agree that people are very unpredictable. So objects like computers or tasks like computer repair or engineering, all of these things are more attractive to a person with Asperger's syndrome because it represents stimuli that are both interesting and predictable. So due to difficulties with generalization skills, the person with Asperger's syndrome has a lower tolerance for unpredictability and complexity. And they argue that objects and non-social tasks are both predictable and simple, whereas people are not. In fact, I've heard many people with Asperger's syndrome state that they view relationships as messy. And the more that they're pressured into being focused on their spouse or partner as opposed to their special interest, the more their anxiety comes up, which makes it even more likely that they'll engage in their special activity or their favorite task for anxiety reduction. So that's why your husband gravitates towards his special interest and work as opposed to anything that involves intense relationships with people.
Let me just go on record as saying this. First of all, there's some NTs that aren't so NT. Secondarily, they have their own version of mind blindness and executive function deficits and anxiety. And what's funny to me, one of the big complaints, number one spot on the list, I get no empathy from him. On further inspection, when I look at how she's treating him, you're doing the same thing. You got no empathy for him. So what makes you so self-righteous that you think you're the victim and he's not? You are very task-oriented,
And you learn to be very self-sufficient and independent and autonomous at a very young age. One of the NT wives, her husband lost a family member, and she wanted to console him, and he didn't really appreciate that. And she was confused as to why. I'm trying to be there for him and show empathy and console him, and it's almost like it's a turnoff to him. And so I said to them the same thing I'm saying to you guys, because you're very autonomous and independent, you will process loss. In this case, we're talking about loss. You will process loss in your own way, on your own time, and you don't need moral support from her. In fact, the more she goes, well, how do you feel? Are you okay? And all this, it almost feels like interrogating. It's like, just, I will deal with my feelings, okay? I don't need your help on me dealing with my feelings. Let's say that she talked you into going to some kind of a family event, some kind of a cookout or whatever, a reunion or whatever, and you went and you kind of got burned out with the idle chit-chat pretty quickly, and you kind of went off over there away from the crowd and got on your phone and kind of entertained yourself. Just made that up, okay? So now, on the way home, she's going to engage in this false assumption stuff again. Well, I don't know why you can't participate. I don't know why we were over there and we were talking and you just left and whatever. You can imagine what you're going to receive, right? So what would be going on in the case where he just was bored to death with chit-chat and it was no fun to him and he went over there and entertained himself? We would want to think, okay, was that a mind blindness thing, an emotions blindness thing, an executive function thing, or an anxiety thing? We could call it an anxiety thing. And this is a hell of a paradox. You wouldn't think that things that are boring raise your anxiety. I'm talking about specifically people on the autism spectrum. You wouldn't necessarily equate boring with anxiety. There is a direct link between something that's exceedingly boring and your anxiety. You like to engage in your special interests, and you can be hyper-focused on that special interest for extended periods of time because it keeps your mind going. It is actually a reward for your brain because we're focused on this and my wheels are turning. When you don't have something that's fairly exciting to you, you get bored, and boredom is painful to people on the autism spectrum. That's not an exaggeration. I'll repeat it. Boredom is exceedingly painful to people on the autism spectrum. So we'll use that. So I'm going to plug it into the 5 things here. Number 1, if you can see the notes, it's let her know the trait that I have. So I'm going to say, well, as you may know, hopefully I have anxiety, and I was honestly kind of bored with the chit-chat, and it was kind of raising my anxiety, and so I went over there to distract myself because I didn't want to be inappropriate in the group. That's step 1. Step 2 is how she's downloading it. I know that may have downloaded to you as I was trying to be antisocial, or that I didn't care about what people were saying, or that I wanted to go home early, perhaps. Maybe that's how you were downloading it. Step 3, what's really going on? What's really going on is boredom, believe it or not, is really a source of stress for me. Number 4, but I still love you and care about you and want to meet your needs. Number 5, so it would be helpful to me if in the future we could not linger at these gatherings for 3 hours. I'm willing to tough it out for an hour. I'm not going to be much good after that 60-minute mark. So in this way, you're letting her know what's really going on, so that she doesn't make the false assumption. And you're offering a solution. You're not saying, well, but it would be helpful to me if you never ever asked me to go anywhere again. That's not what we're shooting for. It would be helpful to me if we went there and I knew that there was going to be a time limit, because in times past when we go somewhere, sometimes it's 2 hours, sometimes it's 4 hours, and I don't know how. So it would be helpful to me if I knew we're going to arrive at such and such time and we're going to be leaving at such and such time, in which case I can tough it out at that point.